Hey everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. Hope everything's going well for you. Congratulations on surviving the swirling vortex of sorrow that was 2020. I'm here. I've made a few changes. For example, I'm wearing a sweater. I don't think I've done that before in the videos, kind of going for a Mr. Rogers vibe here. And we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump right into it. The resolution for PF for January of 2021 is resolved the National Security Agency should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. As always, we want this to be useful, so if it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. We will, as always, have all of our sources in the description below, as well as timestamps if you want to come watch a little and then come back later. And of course, if you want to get our musings on debate and life in general, you can always follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. As you may be able to tell, we're going to go kind of fast on this. I know as debaters, y'all are used to the idea of going fast, so I'm not too worried about it. But there is a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. So what to say about this topic? I don't really like it. I know I say that a lot, and some people have mentioned that in the comments, but I think I have good reasons on this. And you'll see what they are throughout the video, but just briefly, my complaint is not about the topic area, which is perfectly fine. My complaint is about the wording of the resolution, which I think is simultaneously too broad and too narrow, right? The idea of the National Security Agency just ending its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents is really not what authors are talking about when they talk about reform in this area. This is not how serious real-world writers envision the kind of reform that they would do. So what do I mean? Well, when I say it's too narrow, what I mainly mean is it only focuses on one agency. The duties of the intelligence community in the United States are shared across 16 different agencies across 6 different federal departments. And while the NSA does have some specialization that it does, it is far from alone in most of the tasks that it does. So it's really difficult, as the pro in particular, to figure out exactly what the NSA does that nobody else does. And that means you're susceptible in a lot of rounds as the pro to having the con come in and say basically about many, many different arguments, well, if the NSA stops doing this, how do we know that other agencies won't just pick up the ball? Aren't they actually already doing some of these things? And because these duties are shared across multiple agencies, it's actually really tough to get a clean read on exactly what would go away if one agency, the NSA, stopped doing surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. So that's why it's too narrow. It's too narrow in terms of which agency it focuses on. But it's also too broad in the sense that it requires that one agency to, quote, end presumably what are all of its surveillance of U.S. persons. And that would seem to mean that, for example, if the NSA had a very specific reason to say, go get a search warrant about a very specific U.S. citizen who is almost certainly engaged in a terrorist plot, right? Not broad mass collection of data, but a specific surveillance of a specific person, the word end seems to imply that they couldn't even do that. And I don't know of any serious authors who think that that is the right approach. I just think you're not talking in the way that real authors do, right? And then there's one more problem. Third problem is that it is historically kind of a lousy time to debate this topic, since most of the problematic things, or the most problematic things about surveillance with the NSA, were very topical the first time we did a resolution about this in PF, which was back in 2013 when the Edward Snowden information was released. Very topical back then, lots of stuff going on. But since then, you've seen a lot of reform and a lot of the worst abuses of the NSA being reeled back and reined in. I'm not saying there aren't any things you can argue about, but if you go into rounds arguing about the things, like reading cards from the 2013 topic, which are available and you can do that, you're in a very different world. And frankly, it's just a lot less objectionable today than it was before, right? But never fear, in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And as we always say on this channel, if you understand the topic like on a real world factual level, and you can really explain it and tell the story, you're going to have an advantage. And that's true on really good topics and well-phrased topics, but it's also true on topics where maybe they're not so well phrased. If you can understand the problems with it being too narrow and too broad, you'll have a big advantage on the con. And if you can anticipate that and understand what the weaknesses are, you can tailor a pro case to be much more resilient and much more sort of immune to a lot of the criticisms, but you just have to be ready for them. So there is an opportunity to run good cases on this, and I think that we'll identify some of them in the video. To the NSDA, if anybody there is watching this, I will say this: you need to do a better job on topic wording. When you pick a particular type of reform or program program of reform to actually put into the resolution, right? Like ending an agency's surveillance, one agency's surveillance, as opposed to like reforming or restructuring it, you need to look carefully and see if there's actual literature out there arguing for precisely what you're proposing. And if there's not, and there really isn't here, right, then it's not a good wording and you need to revise it. And it's not fair to the kids out there who have to fight their way through an awkwardly worded topic and make these rounds more about like strategy and definitions and gamesmanship rather than substantive learning. You've got to do a better job. I'm sorry. I know you're probably not going to invite me to speak on any panels, but that's how I feel. So with that, we will start with some historical and legal background on NSA surveillance of U.S. citizens and residents. Then we will move into definitions and framework, then the pro, then the con, and then, as always, final thoughts. Okay, so historical and legal background. Like I said a minute ago, U.S. surveillance of citizens and lawful residents is a moving target. It has evolved tremendously since 2001. It's evolved tremendously, frankly, since 2015. If you just go into rounds using cards from the 2013 topic, which you absolutely can find, you're going to find that against good teams, they're going to get called out because the world we live in now is dramatically different. So you have to know a little something about how things are evolving. This will also make you more conversant and better able to describe what's going on to judges, just make you sound smarter, which does help, whether you believe me or not. So we do have to try to do a historical summary. This is going to have to go really fast, and we can't cover nearly everything, but we need to make an attempt at it. So bear with me. I think this will be useful to you. So begin at the beginning. Back in the 18th century with the United States Constitution, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution sets the baseline for how the government is supposed to search, or more accurately, is not supposed to search and surveil, right, citizens and lawful permanent residents, otherwise known in this video as U.S. persons. Throughout the video, just as a by the way, right, throughout the video, I'm going to use the term U.S. persons in many cases as a shorthand for the phrase U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, because that is the term U.S. persons that is used again and again in like agency manuals for the NSA. Other agencies use it in their manuals and policies, so we're going to use it here as kind of a shorthand. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to definitions, but that's what it means, right? So the Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, right? What this basically means is that for every person in the United States, every citizen and lawful permanent resident, right, the government can't just come in and randomly start searching your stuff on a whim. It can't just decide it wants to search things. The founding fathers were very much opposed to the idea of like the crown coming in and searching just because it wanted to, right? This applies to your physical stuff like your house and your car and the things in your backpack, but it also applies to your digital information. The courts have held consistently in the 20th century it applies to things like email, cell phone records, and text messages. So to conduct a search normally, government law enforcement agencies, and including intelligence agencies, right, will have to go before a judge and make a showing to get a search warrant. And to get a search warrant, they'll have to show that they have something called probable cause, which is really just a fancy legal term for a good reason to believe that a crime either has happened or is happening or is about to happen, right? The judge has to issue them a search warrant that gives them permission to search a particular place or a particular like email address or a phone number or something. You get those records, right? And giving them permission to do that, right? Now, this is important because the baseline is that no serious author out there that you're going to find really disputes that the government generally has the right to conduct these kinds of searches, this kind of surveillance of people, if it goes and gets a warrant based on a good reason to believe that that person has done something or is about to do something illegal. So the NSDA probably would have been really well served to specify in the resolution that it is only talking about warrantless surveillance, which is a major issue, not warrant-based surveillance, which happens all the time in the NSA, in the FBI. But we have what we have, right? So this is one reason why maybe having to end all surveillance is a little bit too broad, right? Now, this Fourth Amendment right to be free from warrantless searches clearly applies in normal domestic cases, like if you're accused of committing a crime like, drug distribution or financial fraud. But many experts don't think that it should apply in cases of, things like espionage, things like terrorism, things where you are engaged in sort of the equivalent of war against the United States. Even if you're a citizen, we reserve the right, if you are doing something something that is tantamount to like an act of war or an act of terrorism against us, we don't have to give you all these special procedural protections, including the warrant requirement. Now, this is highly debatable, right? But the basic idea is when it comes to regular crime, everybody accepts that this is legitimate. When it comes to, for example, acts of terrorism and acts of espionage, it is not at all clear, and many people agree that you shouldn't have to have quite as much procedural protection. You shouldn't necessarily have to have a warrant, right? That's one of the core questions, right? The real question is, where do you draw the line between when a U.S. person is merely suspected of like a regular garden variety crime and therefore gets the protection of like having to have a warrant and that sort of stuff, versus the cases when they've stepped beyond that and they're engaged in terrorism or they're engaged in espionage, they're engaged in an act of war, and they don't get that protection. And that's a question we're going to come back to, again and again throughout the video. But that's kind of the core theoretical question in the literature, right? So jumping forward historically into the 20th century, where does the NSA come from? Well, the NSA originated in World War II as a code-breaking unit, right? They were formally established as a federal agency in 1952, and around that same time, many other intelligence agencies, like, for example, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, were also being created and expanded. Because we were entering the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and people rightly believed in the United States that intelligence and spying and decrypting was going to be very important to that, right? And code-breaking and electronic surveillance are still what the NSA specializes in, right? They don't go out generally and cultivate like human confidential informants, do human spying like James Bond type stuff. If you look at the agency's mission statement, it says, quote, "The National Security Agency / Central Security Service leads the U.S. government in cryptology that encompasses both signals intelligence, or SIGINT, which is the shorthand for signals intelligence, and information assurance, now referred to as cybersecurity products and services, and enables computer network operations in order to gain a decision advantage for the nation and our allies under all circumstances," right? Now, signals intelligence and electronic information collection aren't just what the NSA is good at or what it focuses on. It's actually illegal for any of the other 15 intelligence agencies to do it. That's according to Executive Order 13470. An executive order is an order from the president that defines how federal agencies carry out their jobs, right? And it amends a larger executive order called 12333, which is kind of the great granddaddy that spells out how we do all of our intelligence gathering. But what it says specifically with respect to NSA is, quote, "No other department or agency may engage in signals intelligence activities except pursuant to a delegation by the Secretary of Defense." So what that means is that legally, NSA is supposed to be the only agency that does this kind of code breaking, this mass collection of data about people. Now, to be clear, you might be thinking, well, that's wonderful, Brad. Anytime we're doing these collection of data about people, that must mean only the NSA can do it. So that clearly delineates your question earlier about what do they do and what do they not do. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. The truth is, other agencies do collect electronic information in some cases. For example, the FBI gets warrants to collect information about people in national security and terrorism cases all the time. They go and get electronic information like emails all the time. So it's really not quite that simple. What you can take away from 13470 is basically this. If we're talking about the mass, undifferentiated, warrantless collection of information, going out and collecting huge volumes of information from emails and things from like telecom companies, then it is probably true that only NSA can do that under the law. But if you're talking about collecting it from individual people, right, through a search warrant, then other agencies absolutely do that all the time. But that's the basic line in terms of what NSA does that's unique from other folks, right? So anyway, we were talking about how we balance these protections, like when do we get the protections of the Fourth Amendment and when do we not? And the answer is, in a lot of cases, we did a really bad job of balancing these things. So for example, in the 1950s and 60s, while these intelligence agencies were expanding, the U.S. started to see domestic protest movements like the Civil Rights Movement, later the anti-war movement in the 1960s. There was the anti-communist hysteria of Joe McCarthy and others. And there's a lot of this paranoia that there are just people out there who are trying to like undermine the quote-unquote American way of life. And to make a long story very, very short, in the 1950s and 60s, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA treated domestic protest groups like they were basically foreign enemies or terrorists and spied on them with more or less impunity. And this was considered rightly to be a very bad thing. So in 1975, there's an investigation by a congressional special committee headed by Senator Frank Church called the Church Committee, right? Which basically found that the CIA, NSA, and FBI had engaged in a pattern of wiretapping, bugging, surveillance, harassment, threats, and other almost certainly illegal activities activities toward political dissidents and disfavored groups, including, but not limited to, Dr. Martin Luther King himself, who was spied on by them, right? One thing the Church Committee noted was that a lot of this was possible because the laws about intelligence agencies surveilling U.S. persons were so vague that it wasn't really clear what you could do and what you couldn't do, which led to a very important legislative development, which was the introduction of the Foreign Intelligence Service Act, or FISA, which was enacted in 1978. FISA provides the scaffolding and the framework for everything you're going to see that comes after this, right? The big idea behind FISA, well, actually a lot of ideas behind FISA, but the big one for our purposes was to establish a legal framework for surveillance that was either aimed at or could potentially affect U.S. persons. And one of the most significant things it did to that end was it created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC, often just referred to as the FISA court, right? And the FISA court is essentially a classified top secret court that intelligence agencies have to go to in order to obtain an order letting them conduct surveillance of a particular person or group, right? In some ways, like going to a regular judge to get a regular search warrant, like we talked about a minute ago, except that it is highly classified, and there are other differences that we can't go through. Among other things, the only party that goes before it is the government. Obviously, the accused terrorist does not get a chance to defend themselves, but that's also true with a search warrant. You don't bring in a regular criminal to a regular court and let them contest the search warrant. You just go search, and then they can challenge it later on, which is more or less true with the FISA court, right? At any rate, under FISA, these orders or warrants for searching are only supposed to be granted where you are searching either a, quote, foreign power or a, quote, agent of a foreign power, right? But here's the thing. A U.S. person absolutely can be considered a, quote, agent of a foreign power. The test for whether that's the case is set forth in a statute that we'll link to, which is 50 U.S.C. section 1801B. We're also going to link to a Justice Department brief that does a great job of explaining the standards for when you can and can't get a FISA warrant, when you can and can't search a U.S. person. You can delve into that if you want. You don't really have to get too deep in the weeds, but it's there if you need it. But the bottom line is the government, whether it's the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, or any other agency, has to show probable cause, right? In other words, a good reason to believe that a particular person has engaged in, is engaging in, or is about to engage in spying, terrorism, or other like clandestine activities on behalf of a foreign power. And by the way, the term foreign power doesn't have to be like a sovereign country like Russia or China. It can be a terrorist group or even a non-state political group, right? Okay, so that's the basic standard under FISA, and for 20 plus years, from 1978, the United States rolls along under FISA. The Cold War ends in the 90s. Maybe people feel like it's not such a big deal, but then in 2001, the major turning point on this resolution, 9/11, happens, right? And in the wake of 9/11, there is this questioning of how we could possibly let this happen, right? How did we not detect this? How did we not stop this? And in response, in hindsight, and frankly, a panicked response as opposed to a considered response, the federal government starts making lots of changes to our intelligence and surveillance protocols and stripping away a lot of the restrictions that constrain them. And most importantly, in October 2001, Congress passes the USA Patriot Act. Now, the Patriot Act does a lot of things to greatly expand the surveillance power of the federal government, but the most important for our purposes was Section 215, which gave the government the power to demand pretty much any information it wanted from businesses in the United States, including telecom providers and internet companies. And to make a long story very, very short, the Bush administration decided that Section 215 gave it the authority to basically collect any electronic data it wanted from any internet or telecom company it wanted about anybody it wanted by any method it wanted, right? Almost completely unfettered surveillance authority over U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons. But in 2005, the New York Times revealed that the Bush administration had allowed NSA to wiretap and spy on the calls of Americans without ever seeking a FISA warrant, which was still required under the law. And this was, in hindsight, pretty clearly illegal. And this was kind of the beginning of the pushback, right? This was when Congress and the American people started pushing back and rolling back some of these very broad surveillance powers that you saw under the Patriot Act and under these executive orders. And we don't have anywhere near the time to walk through every step of that process. I'm going to link to some sources that talk about it, but for the time being, there are a few basic steps you need to be aware of in the sort of rolling back and the changing and the metamorphosing of this, right? So in 2007, targeted surveillance without a FISA warrant warrant was ended. On January 17th, 2007, Attorney General Alberto Gonzales confirmed that this program of allowing targeted surveillance of U.S. persons and others without a warrant had ended, confirmed that it would no longer, go on, right? And I guess it's time for kind of a caveat, which is you might say, Brett, how do we know that's happening? And the answer to that, and the answer that you might give in a round if somebody says, how do we know, is the answer is all we can do in this debate round is debate it based on publicly available information. Is it possible that the NSA, right, not the NSDA, right, the NSA is doing things that we don't know about in a clandestine way? Yes, it's possible. They've done it before. But the only things we can debate about are the things we know about. So we're going to have to assume that the things we're told in the literature are accurate, right? So in 2007, you get rid of the targeted surveillance. In 2008, a law called the FISA Amendments Act adds a new provision to FISA called Section 702. And that gives NSA and the FBI a new power, but specifically it gives the NSA the ability to do certain targeted searches of non-US persons outside the United States without ever having to go get a warrant. All they have to do is describe the general terms that they want to search for and submit an annual report to the FISA showing that they're trying to sort of minimize the extra data they collect. But under 702, they get to go out and collect large amounts of information without having to seek a specific warrant, right? Can't be against a U.S. person, but the basic problem is, as we're going to talk about later under 702, these searches are so broad that while you might be targeting a person in, say, Saudi Arabia or in China or somewhere like that, you're inevitably going to sweep in huge amounts of data about people in the United States that's all going to go into a database, right? Section 702 encompasses two kinds of searches: downstream or PRISM searches, where the NSA tells companies, basically give us this information about this person, and the even more controversial upstream search, where the NSA just taps into the internet backbone directly and intercepts the data itself with no involvement by the company at all. So that's 2008. Fast forward to 2015, bulk data collection of U.S. communication ends. This is after Edward Snowden blows the whistle on data collection in 2013, and the provisions that allow for just mass collection of U.S. data on calls and internet traffic end, right? They expire. And certain portions of the Patriot Act that allowed them are replaced with provisions of what's called the USA Freedom Act. And the USA Freedom Act amends Section 215 to create something called the Call Detail Records program. So instead of being able to just go out and collect whatever data you wanted anywhere in the world, now under the Call Detail Records program under 2015, at least back in 2015, right, the NSA can go out and get a warrant against a specific person and get their call data and also the call data from the people that they've called and the call data from the people that they've called. We'll talk about that in a second. It's called the two-hop rule, right? In 2017, NSA ends upstream collection. This is where they just go in and directly intercept the stuff. They look at it, they analyze it, they decide that it is not effective, that it is not cost effective, and they voluntarily end it in 2017. And then in 2019, the NSA voluntarily ends the Call Detail Records program. In other words, the replacement that it got back in 2015, it does away with it. It says we don't want to do call detail records anymore. We don't want to do this two-hop collection anymore. We don't think it's worthwhile. And in 2020, the statutory authorization for the call detail records program expires, right? So it is sort of double killed. Now, I know that's a lot to take in. I realize it's a huge amount. It's actually a really, really brief version of the story. But what you really need to know from this video is, what is the status quo today? What kinds of searching is the NSA doing in the status quo right now after all this rapid evolution over the last 10 or 20 years? And at the end of the day, as we sit here in 2021, there are two, maybe three basic types of surveillance that you need to be aware of. Now, I'm not going to in any way warrant that there aren't some programs out there, some minor ones that I haven't caught. This is, again, it's a reason why it's not a great resolution. There probably are programs that I haven't covered. I'm not a flawless expert on this, but there are two, maybe three major types of searching you need to be aware of if you want to be able to speak intelligently on this, right? The first is traditional surveillance. The second is 702 warrantless surveillance. And the maybe third one is Section 215 call detail records, although we'll talk about that in a second. So first, you have traditional surveillance, traditional direct surveillance of U.S. persons via a FISA warrant based on probable cause that they're acting as an agent of a foreign power. This is what some people call traditional surveillance. It would be really, really hard for the pro to advocate for ending this entirely. Literally no serious author that I have seen thinks you shouldn't have some some mechanism to go out and do surveillance of people when you've got good specific reasons, like targeted surveillance of one person when you've got a good reason to believe that they are engaging in some kind of potential terrorism, right? So as the pro, you really don't want this traditional FISA warrant-based searching to be considered topical. You don't want it to be part of your burden of something that you have to end in order to end surveillance by the NSA, right? You don't want the judge to believe, well, if I think that they should be able to go intercept Bob Smith's calls because he's clearly engaged in terrorism, then I vote con. That's not a place you want to be. Now, fortunately, there's a good argument that the traditional warrant requirement really is not the focus of this resolution, and that is because the FBI does them all the time too, right? That they get FISA warrants and they go out and surveil U.S. persons all the time, right? Collect their data all the time, just like the NSA does. So one thing the pro can say is we're really not talking about traditional warrant-based FISA searches here, because if the NSA stops doing them, the FBI and probably the CIA and other agencies will continue to do them just the same. So you are not going to be getting rid of the ability to do traditional search, warrant-based, go to the FISA court, get a warrant, search this one person. You're not going to be doing away with that if you affirm the resolution. That's not what it's about, because other agencies will still have the power to do this. We're just going to keep our international cryptography spy agency from doing it. We're going to let other agencies like the FBI do it, right? And if I were the pro, I would definitely say that. I'd say this is not what this resolution is about, because I don't want to be in a position where I have to defend the government just turning a blind eye to situations where there is probable cause that an individual is engaged in terrorism, right? The second type of surveillance that NSA does is warrantless surveillance of foreign actors under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, right? Using what we talked about earlier, which was the PRISM downstream collection or the upstream collection. This is one where you don't get a FISA warrant. It must be a target who is a non-U.S. person outside the United States. And it's a decent candidate for what I think the pro might want to use as its advocacy, right? Because remember, Section 702 is different. You don't get a warrant. Instead, all you have to do is submit like an annual statement to the FISA court that explains who you're targeting, like not specifically who you're targeting, but like how you're choosing your targets, right? How you're trying to minimize the collection of extraneous data. And they basically rubber stamp it, and you as the NSA can go out and essentially do whatever you want within those parameters, right? That may be a little glib. I'm sure NSA folks would disagree with that, but you have a lot of leeway, I think it's fair to say, right? Additionally, this is good because it is more or less limited to the NSA, right? Because under Executive Order 13470, NSA is the only agency that can initiate signals intelligence and actually collect this data, right? Now, to be clear, the FBI can select targets for 702 surveillance, and it can go to the NSA and it can ask the NSA to collect information about them, right? But only the NSA can actually do the collection, and that is confirmed in a 2014 report from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, or PCLOB, which is a great acronym, right, which is the federal agency charged with overseeing privacy in intelligence gathering, and it says, quote, only the NSA may initiate 702 collection. So if the NSA gets out of the domestic surveillance game, that means there will be no 702 collection, period, right? Now, this would at least arguably be a pretty clean way to do the resolution. We get rid of 702. There's no more warrantless searching that collects millions of, and I guess I should digress and say there is evidence out there that millions and millions and millions of pieces of data about U.S. persons, calls, emails, call metadata, things like that, get swept up in the dragnet of Section 702 searches, right? So you get millions of pieces of information about U.S. folks, even though they're inadvertent, even though they're unintentional, they all go into a database, right, that the FBI, the CIA, and others potentially can search, right? So even though the NSA is the one doing the collection, other agencies get access to it, and we'll talk in a little bit about why that's problematic. Now, reality check is completely getting rid of 702, something a lot of authors are talking about. Not really. Most of them want to reform it, but it's not crazy. There are some folks out there like the Electronic Frontier Foundation that actually do say that repealing 702 and just getting rid of it might be a viable option. So this may be the least bad choice for the pro in terms of saying what we do is we get rid of 702, that gets rid of this collection of mass data, and we just don't do it anymore. We do our searching based on warrants under FISA, right? Now, the third and final choice after traditional searching in 702 is Section 215 call detail records, or CDR, collection of call data, right? Now, remember, this is the one that does require a FISA warrant, and you can do the two-hop rule, right? You can collect not only the person who's the subject of the warrant, but the people who call them and the people who call them. So, if the target calls 20 people and they each call 20 people, one warrant under this could result in 400 people getting their calls, their data collected, right? This would be a great candidate for pro-advocacy, except for one thing, which is that it's already stopped, right? So Keir Lamont in May 2020 noted that Section 215 and the programs under it require periodic renewal by Congress, and on March 15th of 2020, after a previous short extension, that expired, right? So Congress has allowed the CDR program to expire. And he also notes that even before that happened, back in August of 2019, the NSA affirmatively decided to abandon and stop doing the CDR on its own, right? So it doesn't do call deals, at least it says it doesn't do call detail records anymore because of what it called performance issues, low intelligence value, high associated costs. So even the NSA itself thought that this was a low value proposition, right? Now, I guess there is a defensible argument. Why could you? You could say, well, the CDR is not completely dead yet, right? It hasn't been completely abolished. They haven't passed a law getting rid of it forever. It could be reauthorized tomorrow by a deadline extension from Congress. So I guess you might argue that it could be topical. But again, the word end in the resolution, as we're going to talk about, it's kind of hard to argue that you're going to end something that has been stopped now twice, both voluntarily by the agency and by Congress itself, right? So there is that. So anyway, I know that was a lot to cover, and I'm sorry it was so complicated, but there's no way to understand this topic unless you get just like a really brief background on it. So with that, we will jump forward now and look at some definitions and some framework. Okay, so framework and definitions. Really quickly on framework, I usually don't spend a lot of time talking about like weighing mechanisms and things like that in high school public forum debate, but I do want to say one thing in particular about like framing generally for the pro on this, which is that you might want to give some thought, because the wording of the resolution is kind of so far off of any like real world proposal. Like, we've had the Medicare for All Act debated recently that gives you a very specific like thing that you can point to that is very much a real world proposal. This is the opposite of that. This is something that nobody's really talking about. And we could spend hours, and we are spending an hour here, talking about how to square this weird wording with how things would work. And so one thing you might think about as the pro is kind of making an almost theory argument. I'm not saying put this in the case, but being ready to argue that the judge shouldn't sweat the details, right? That the judge should base the round just more generally on the principle of whether the NSA's involvement is good or bad, and that the government can figure out the details later on of exactly how removing the NSA would work. Like, this isn't policy debate. I'm not allowed to run a plan. We've got to try to be fair. We've got a total of like 40 minutes to argue. Our speeches are 4 minutes long. Judge, you can't ask that we know every single detail of every single program and be able to show you exactly how the intelligence world would work afterward. You should base the round more on the general principled question of, is the NSA doing domestic surveillance good or bad? And you should assume that the government, as with everything else it does, can figure out a way to make it work if you pull the NSA out, right? I don't know that I would read that in my case. You might, depending on the circuit you're in, but I would be ready to make that argument, because otherwise you do run the risk of kind of being nitpicked to death on details by a good con team that just talks about how ill-fitting this idea is with like a lot of the real world literature, okay? So definitions, really quickly. National Security Agency, I don't think there's really a definitional question here. We know obviously what the agency is. It's more like just the idea we talked about earlier of understanding what specifically the NSA does and what its unique function is. And I just think you need to understand that under Executive Order 13470, basically what you can say is the unique function of NSA is going out and doing mass collection of data. That's the thing that it does that other agencies don't do. Other agencies can go and do warrant-based surveillance. They can go and do getting confidential informants, doing traditional spycraft. There are a million different things they can do. But the one thing that NSA has that's unique is mass collection of data, which is why that is kind of the simple, cut the Gordian knot way for the pro potentially to frame it, right? And using Executive Order 13470, or at least having it in your back pocket, might be a good idea, right? How do you explain exactly what you're doing in the resolution? It depends on where you're debating. It depends on the circuit. In some places, you might want to have an observation at the top of the case that essentially says, let me make one observation. Here's what's going to happen when you do this, right? 702 is going to go away, but warrant-based surveillance is not, right? If you don't read that in the case, you definitely want to be able to explain it in Crossfire and be able to explain in practical terms exactly what's going away and what's not. So you might read it in the case, you might do it in Crossfire, you might save it for a rebuttal, but you certainly need to have it ready. The next term would be surveillance. In terms of what surveillance means, I think the con really has to try to hold the pro's feet to the fire and use a broad definition on this. The resolution just does not say warrantless surveillance. If NSDA had wanted to limit this to warrantless surveillance, it could have done that. It could have easily said warrantless surveillance, but it didn't. And that means that we look at all surveillance. And when we look at definitions of it, for example, the Cambridge Dictionary, the definition is the careful watching of a person or place, especially by the police or army, because of a crime that has happened or is expected. Well, this is broad enough, especially because it mentions like the police, right, to encompass your standard warrant-based searches and non-warrant-based searches. You don't get to exclude warrant-based searches. You have to prove, pro, that we should get rid of those, right? I think you have to hold their feet to the fire on that. I think the much more interesting question, though, is the juxtaposition of the word surveillance with the phrase of U.S. citizens and LPRs. Now, there's a tricky but not crazy argument here, which is that just because surveillance affects a U.S. person, that does not make it surveillance of a U.S. person. Remember, we said earlier that there are basically, if you take away the Call Detail Records program, which ended in 2019, there are two basic types of NSA surveillance. One is traditional warrant-based surveillance, which we're going to argue, nobody thinks that ought to stop, right? The other, right, is Section 702 surveillance. And remember, under Section 702 surveillance, we're targeting non-U.S. persons, but our big concern is that we are inadvertently sweeping in like millions and millions of calls and millions of pieces of information about U.S. persons, right? But the problem with that might be a sort of a topicality argument, which is even if we are sweeping in all this information, and even if it's problematic, and even if it's bad, that doesn't mean that it is surveillance of a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, right? If I go on a police stakeout and I am surveilling the apartment of a known criminal, and you, as a non-criminal, just happen to walk up to like the bike rack and steal a bike right in front of me, and you don't see me there, right? I'm probably going to arrest you. That doesn't mean I was surveilling you. You just happened to walk in front of me and commit a crime, right? If I am the police and I'm searching the home of a known drug distributor and I find a note that they have written to you where they're asking you where to get their next shipment, I wasn't surveilling you, but I got information about you, right? So the idea would be to say, as the con, that Section 702, at least insofar as it affects U.S. persons, is not topical, because while the surveillance affects U.S. people, U.S. persons, right, citizens and lawful permanent residents, right, it is not surveillance of that person. It is surveillance of someone else that just happens to stumble upon details about this person. It's a little tricky, but it is far from the trickiest topicality argument I've ever seen, and it would be one thing you could hit back on a 702 case and really give the pro fits and say, look, this is not surveillance of U.S. people. It might be bad, it might be problematic, it might be a reason to change a policy, but they were not surveilling U.S. citizens. They were surveilling somebody else, and they just got caught up. So it's not topical, right? Depends on what kind of judges you have, depends on what kind of circuit you're in, right? End. End is another issue. Webster and most dictionaries define the verb form of end by reference to, like, to bring to an end. So you look to the noun form. The noun form, according to Webster, is cessation of a course of action, pursuit, or activity, death or destruction, or the ultimate state. Cambridge defines it as to make something finish or stop. I think the only big takeaway here is that end means that something has to stop with no intention to resume. So I don't think the pro can run a case where, we stop it for now, but if we ever have a big emergency, we can bring it back. I think you have to have an intention that it not come back, but I don't think other than that it's very controversial. And then lastly, U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. I think here the simplest thing to do is look at the FISA statute itself and how it defines these terms. It uses the term U.S. persons. U.S. persons includes citizens, lawful permanent residents. It also includes groups with large numbers of U.S. citizens and U.S. corporations. And because it lists those separately, in other words, it has citizens and lawful permanent residents, but then it has like groups and corporations and it puts them separately. I think there's a strong argument that the resolution actually does not apply to corporations. Sometimes you see arguments that, well, under U.S. law, corporations are considered citizens. That's actually not true. Under U.S. law, corporations are considered persons, like, for example, in certain election law cases. They're really not considered citizens. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to run for office. So I think when we say citizens and lawful permanent residents, we are clearly talking about individuals, because a corporation is, contrary to popular opinion, not considered a citizen. It may be considered a person, but it's not considered a citizen. So those are the basic definitional issues. And now, at long last, let's jump in and talk about the pro before we move on to the con. Okay, so let's talk about some pro arguments. I'm not going to lie, this is a topic on which both sides, and particularly the pro, but really both sides, are going to have a hard time easily linking to a lot of really concrete, well-defined, like numeric impacts, right? So, for example, on Medicare for All, you could look to study after study about, the dollars saved, the lives lost, things like that. In this case, you can't do it for two reasons. One is because this is just by its nature such a clandestine, secretive thing. I mean, the impacts that you get are secondhand stories about the number of plots that have been foiled and things like that. It's very difficult to put any kind of, quantification on exactly how much this affects the United States or the world, because by its nature, this surveillance is highly classified and highly secret, right? And then number two, because the wording of the resolution, again, not to complain about this or harp about it, but getting rid of NSA's ability to do surveillance entirely is just not something people are writing about. Nobody really envisions that as the solution. So it's difficult to go out and even find like studies and things where people sort of speculate about what that would do, right? Because nobody's really thinking about doing that. So you're going to have to go with more with general principles. And I know you guys, you're incredibly creative. I see in the questions and the videos, ideas you come up with, and they're great. I'm sure you will come up with good impacts, but I'm going to focus more on general principles. And I will say that if you go up against teams on either side that are selling like inordinately, strangely specific, definite, impacts, you really need to be ready in crossfire and in your rebuttal to sort of hit back and explain to the judge, there's no way you can be this certain, right? The whole program is highly classified. We have no idea what impact it has, and really explain how, they're sort of selling you snake oil if they claim to know it will save X number of lives. Maybe X number of dollars is possible. We'll talk about that, but it's really hard to really have definite impacts. So, with that, I think the core message of the pro is pretty straightforward. We have domestic law enforcement agencies that also have the capacity to look at like international terrorism, like the FBI, right? And they have the capacity to do your day-to-day FISA, search warrant things, right? They have experience with that. But the NSA is not one of them. The NSA is a spy agency created in the wake of World War II to go look at the Russians, to go look at the Chinese, to intercept, satellite data and things like that. They are not well suited to this world of balancing the rights of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. And the best solution, as we've seen them try to do this and sneak around and mislead people and get it wrong for 20 years now, the best solution is to just get them out completely and let somebody who's more adept at things like due process do it. I think that's the core message that the pro is going to be sending. They've had enough opportunities. They're just not a good fit for it. We need to let the people who are better suited to balancing these things do it, right? So 3 basic themes. The first one is going to be just the right to privacy. I think you absolutely have to have something in the case that talks about, invasions of the right to privacy. So the first thing you have to do is establish that privacy is being violated. So, for example, Human Rights Watch in 2017 just points out that although the government can't designate U.S. persons as targets under Section 702 monitoring, it can still capture or scan their internet or telephone conversations as part of the surveillance. A U.S. person is a legal term that includes citizens and green card holders and so on and so forth. In terms of how many times these searches are occurring, you can point to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence 2019 Transparency Statement, which is a fantastic source of sort of raw data directly from these agencies themselves about how often these searches occur. So you definitely want to take a look at that. But it tells us that the number of searches under 702 is not tapering off. It's going up from about 80,000 in 2013 to over 200,000 in 2019. So it is a problem that's getting worse. The number of searches is increasing. How many communications are collected in these searches? Well, the Brennan Center notes in May 2020 that we're probably talking overall about hundreds of millions of electronic communications overall. We don't know for sure how many of those are communications that come from Americans, but Barton Gellman of the Century Foundation says that there is credible evidence, if you look at estimates and look at what experts think, to believe that tens of millions of American citizens and lawful permanent residents have had their data captured by 702, right? So it's a tremendous number of people who are having their privacy compromised. And by the way, the danger to U.S. persons here of having this information used in a way that is adverse to them is not hypothetical. It's not imaginary. It's real. You can point to the fact that according to declassified FISA court rulings that were published in The Intercept in October of 2019, back in 2017 alone, there were 3.1 million government searches for information about U.S. persons in the database of information that is created under 702. Now, typically these searches are not always done by NSA. In many cases, in most cases, they're actually done by the FBI. But remember, the data only gets there because NSA goes out and actually collects it because they're the agency that actually has to do the collection, right? So if you didn't have tons of compromising private information about U.S. Citizens and lawful permanent residents, the FBI and others wouldn't be searching this database 3.1 million times in 1 year. They wouldn't be looking there for information about U.S. persons if it weren't chock full of potentially compromising information about U.S. persons. Another thing you can say is that, that's pretty strong evidence. If there's 3.1 million searches for U.S. person information, right, there's got to be a ton of it there. It's not fair to ask the pro to be more specific than that and tell you what's in there, because the whole problem, Judge, is that we don't know what's in there. So you should assume it's compromising stuff that dramatically affects the interest of these people, because again, it's in the hands of NSA. If they wanted to release it, they probably could declassify some of it, maybe at least, right? So we can assume that it's very compromising information because again, the whole problem is we don't know, right? And it's not fair to ask us to prove something that's confidential, right, and classified. That's not all in terms of problems with privacy. The same article from The Intercept found that, for example, like during a 4-day period in March 2017, the FBI searched mass surveillance data for communications related to an FBI facility, suggesting that its agents were spying on other agents. On 1 day in 2017, the FBI conducted 6,800 queries about people using social security numbers. A contract linguist for the FBI conducted searches on himself, other FBI employees, and relatives. And the FBI regularly uses mass surveillance to investigate potential witnesses and informants who were neither suspected of crimes nor national security concerns. In other words, it uses this data to learn about people who are not even suspected even remotely of committing any crime, right? So essentially what you argue is that Section 702 mass surveillance, when it's eventually turned over to these other agencies, the NSA produces it and then turns it over to these other agencies in this mass database, just makes a complete farce and a complete joke out of the idea of privacy, out of the idea the government is not supposed to get your information without a warrant, but here they are collecting millions and millions of pieces of information, having the FBI search it millions and millions of times, right? They shouldn't be able to do that. The program should go away, and that's basically what we're advocating for. So what are the impacts of these privacy violations? Well, the first thing I think you have to say is that, the right not to have your information used indiscriminately and harvested indiscriminately by the government without a warrant is just an inherently important human right in and of itself. So, for example, Article 12 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that one of the fundamental human rights that we all have is to the right to privacy, and it says basically no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Well, this is a direct violation of almost every principle in that statement from the UN Declaration, right? You are having your privacy and your correspondence interfered with. You are in jeopardy of having your reputation and your interests affected. We're seeing how it's getting searched and used by the FBI because, and because it's secret and classified, you really have no legal recourse. You will never have an opportunity ever to go before like the FISA court or anyone else and challenge the inclusion of your information there because you'll never know it's there. And even if you did, you have no legal mechanism to ever challenge it legally whatsoever, right? So this is a direct violation of almost every principle of Article 12 of the UN Declaration. But if you want to be more specific, Human Rights Watch also argues that Section 702 specifically violates international human rights norms and international human rights laws. It says, quote, Section 702 contains several basic flaws that make it non-compliant with binding international human rights law. For example, under human rights law, government monitoring of communications must be both necessary and proportionate to achieving a legitimate goal. However, Section 702 gives the executive branch license to conduct extremely intrusive surveillance for a very broad array of potential reasons and to search through any data it happens to capture, regardless of whether that data has anything to do with the original purpose of the surveillance. No judge or other independent body ever signs off on the surveillance. And I'm just adding this, not before, before, not after, not ever. There is no judicial review ever of the information that is captured under 702. Okay, back to the story, right? A situation that violates rights and increases the risk of other abuses, since the executive branch activities are not subject to strict and comprehensive oversight by any other branch of government. Some of these flaws are such fundamental characteristics of 702 that it is difficult, if not impossible, to envision any version of the law that would respect the rights of people both inside and outside the United States. In other words, 702 is fundamentally incompatible with the basic requirements of international human rights law because it's just this catch-all with no legal resource whatsoever. It's not just that it's bad, not just that it's not ideal. It is that there is no legal review, no way that you can go in and challenge your data being held by it, and that's what's fundamentally incompatible. You could also try to link to things like free expression. Human Rights Watch, in the same 2017 article, argues that it jeopardizes free expression rights since people who know that the government may spy on them without good reason may be less likely to express or explore controversial views or discuss sensitive personal matters. This goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier about the spying that went on against dissident groups in the 50s and 60s. One of the ideas behind it was to chill discussion of things like civil rights and chill discussion of things like communism and ideas that the government didn't like. Not so much that we'll catch you, we'll just make you afraid to talk about it, and we will chill your group's ability to advocate. Now, I don't have any links, I couldn't find any, maybe you can, for how that's actually going on today. It's difficult to prove, right? Because again, nobody comes out and says, hey, yes, by the way, I'm a dissident and I'm afraid to say what I have to say about the government, and I'm going to write an article about how afraid I am to say it because of NSA surveillance. You kind of just have to assume it, but that argument can be made on a common sense level at least. Another harm is just the thought that you are being monitored is actually a harm into itself. When people think that NSA surveillance is hurting their privacy, that is a harm in itself. So Jillian York for the Electronic Frontier Foundation noted in 2014 that the way we interact with the internet is undoubtedly changing as a result of our knowledge of mass surveillance. Fear and withdrawal are not the only reaction to this knowledge. Our habits are changing as well. A September 2013 Pew survey found that 86% of internet users have taken steps to remove or mask their digital footprint, steps ranging from clearing cookies to encrypting their email. A further 55% of users have taken steps to avoid observation by specific people, organizations, or the government, right? And it goes on to discuss more about how people are just, afraid of the idea that the government might be watching them. This has been updated since 2014 by a Pew Research survey in 2019 that found that 64% of Americans are at least somewhat concerned that the government is monitoring them online. And the basic idea is that one of the reasons we have a right to privacy, most of the people who use a right to privacy never end up having like a Fourth Amendment lawsuit. They never end up getting, prosecuted for something. You just want to be able to feel in your day-to-day life like you can Google something, right? Like you can have a controversial idea and not have to self-censor. And it's impossible to measure how much people do that. But when we are doing surveillance programs that affect U.S. persons, right, and collect their data, if people self-censor themselves, unless there's a darn good reason why we have to do that and have no other option, the harm that they impose on themselves through self-censorship and the lack of their enjoyment and freedom of life, that is an end unto itself. That is something that's worthwhile in and of itself, right? So various ways that you can sort of impact the idea of privacy, right? Second major theme is that NSA surveillance is ineffective, it's cost ineffective, and maybe even counterproductive, right? So the pro is going to have to preempt and address the inevitable contention that NSA surveillance is saving lives and protecting national security. And the best way to do that, as in almost every case in debate, right? If you know something's coming, don't just sit there and wait to play defense. If you can, go on offense, right? Go ahead and try to turn the impact and push back in the other direction. Worst case scenario, even if you don't do that, they'll call it a draw and you will have beaten some of their offense, right? So always try to go on offense with it. And the basic argument here is that warrantless surveillance programs are costly, they're ineffective, they may actually be making us less safe by distracting us with huge quantities of information and creating backdoors and things like that. So you can start with a good general summary. ProPublica in 2015 had a very good summary of just how ineffective warrantless surveillance programs by the NSA have been. Now this comes from the FBI General Counsel, but remember, the FBI gets its data in these cases from NSA searches under, mass surveillance, right? So even though it's from the FBI, they're getting their data from the NSA. But here's what it says. The FBI General Counsel defined as useful leads that make a substantive contribution to identifying a terrorist or identifying a potential confidential informant. Just 1.2% of them fit into that category. In 2006, she conducted a comprehensive study of all the leads generated from the content basket of the Stellar Wind program and discovered that 0 of them had been useful. The program was generating numerous tips to the FBI about suspicious phone numbers and email addresses, and it was the job of the FBI field offices to pursue those leads and scrutinize the people behind them. The tips were so frequent and such a waste of time that the field offices reported back in frustration, "You are sending us garbage," right? In other words, the vast majority of the information produced by 702 and these other indiscriminate collection programs are just garbage. They're noise with no signal, and people in the FBI who take the information from the NSA, they believe that, right? Another way of coming at this, Jamil Jaffer in 2013 has a good piece, a good article. We'll put a card in there from it that basically says that the real need in the U.S. intelligence community is not more data. They got more data than they know what to do with, right? The amount of data they have, again, is overwhelming them. It's like a tidal wave of data. And that what they really need is better tools to sort through the data that they have. And that if anything, overwhelming them with more undifferentiated information in these massive sweeps like under 702 is just distracting them from paying more attention to the good data, right? So that article from Jaffer in 2013, it's a little bit dated, but it's still a pretty good idea. The other thing you need to do is probably preempt this statistic or this number you're going to inevitably hear from many pros, which is the idea that NSA surveillance has allegedly foiled something like 50 or 54 terror plots. And you need to be able to hit back on that and explain why it's based on absolutely nothing, right? So this is defensive, but it's important defense, right? This claim was made back in 2013 by President Obama, but as Elliott and Meyer in ProPublica note, there is no evidence that it's true other than just taking the NSA's word for it, because all of these plots were classified. There is no way that you can go and test this or look for the data. And on the pro, you need to be ready to hit back on these sketchy self-serving numbers. You need to say, look, we already know that the NSA has misled people, which is something we're going to talk about in a minute. And we know that it's, that since this claim was first made in 2013, the NSA has decided itself that large portions of its spying program, the Section 215 CDR program and the upstream program, were basically useless, and it has abandoned them, and they don't work, and they're not necessary. And we also know that they have every incentive to shade the truth in their own favor, right? The other thing that you can note about this 50 to 54 plots foiled thing is that in this article from ProPublica back in 2013, they quote one person who actually has seen the classified information about these 54 plots, which is former Senator Patrick Leahy. And they have a quote from him where he says, yeah, it's overblown. It really didn't foil 54 plots. It's misleading. So that's a really good quote to have, where you've got a reliable, well-respected senator who's saying, nah, I've seen it. It's not what they're saying. It hasn't, resulted in that. So, what you need to be ready to do is to say you can't just rely on these baseless claims from this totally non-transparent agency about how great it is. The NSA has all the data about this in its own hands, and it won't declassify it. If it's in their hands and they won't give it to us, the fair thing to say is we should assume it's not true. Right? You've got the data in your hands, NSA. You can't just come in here and it's like going into court and saying, Your Honor, my client didn't commit securities fraud, right? And the court says, well, how do we know that? And the lawyer says, well, because he has lots of records that prove that he's innocent. And the court is like, well, where are they? And the response is, well, he doesn't want to show them to you, but just trust me. He's seen them, and he told me they exist and that they prove he's innocent. That's what this 50 to 54 number is. It's trust us. We've got secret information that shows how great we are. And you can't rely on that in debate. And you need to be ready to explain that, right? Next point under counterproductive and inefficient is the NSA itself has concluded that 2 of its flagship mass surveillance programs are costly and ineffective, right? So this first, according to the PCLOB PCLOB member, Edward Felton in March 2020 has an article, I think in The Hill, noting that according to NSA's own internal assessments, the Call Detail Record program, CDR program, cost over $100 million and produced only 2 leads that couldn't have been obtained by other means, right? As far as I know, neither of those actually thwarted a terror plot. Nobody said that, but I've just never heard that they did, right? But the NSA itself made this determination that this program was too costly and wasn't doing anything. It also affirmatively abandoned its upstream program, the one where it directly taps into the internet backbone. It just gave up on that. So you don't have to take our word for it, Judge. I mean, half the time when the NSA looks at its own programs and all this power that the government's given it to do this domestic surveillance, it says we don't want it anymore. So the NSA is telling you again and again that a lot of the things that it's done are not necessary, right? And then the last thing you can say under the sort of counterproductive argument is that NSA surveillance makes us less safe, right? And here you sort of want to go on the offense, and you can point to the fact that NSA surveillance tactics actually may compromise our cybersecurity. And this comes from the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 2013, citing Bruce Shire in the NIT Technology Review. And it basically says that the NSA, as part of these programs like 702, installs backdoors into, or it either uses legal authority or it uses political pressure to persuade private companies to install backdoors so they can get into their network. And as Reuters noted in 2020, these backdoors and vulnerabilities are still being installed to this day. And there is at least one record, I think in 2015, in which these backdoors have actually led to the compromising of a private network. There's not extensive evidence that it happens all the time, but again, it makes us less safe. And if it's not producing any actual leads, why continue to put these backdoors in, right? And then the last point that you can make when you're on the pro is that ending surveillance is the only answer because you just can't trust the NSA, right? You can't change the law because the NSA is constantly violating the law. And this comes from section215.org, which has a really good list of just all the ways in which the NSA has over time allegedly violated the law, misled folks, withheld information. It just says, guarded by the secrecy that shrouds these collection tools, the executive branch has been in nearly constant violation of FISA and the rules governing surveillance since September 11, 2001. And during this time, it has warrantlessly collected information on virtually every American, right? And the basic idea here is that you can't, it's beyond the ability to go in and fix. You just have to accept that it is unfixable, and you have to take this power away from the NSA. And they have a good list of all the ways in which the NSA has misled folks, right, and has not been forthcoming. Another argument from Human Rights Watch in 2017 is that Section 702 in particular has been used for non-terrorism, non-national security purposes. The whole compromise here that we're making is if we're going to have these tools that don't have a warrant and don't have Fourth Amendment protections, they should only be used in special cases like terrorism and national security. But according to Human Rights Watch, it says, according to the documents disclosed by Edward Snowden, the PRISM program has been used for purposes related to narcotics and other forms of trafficking, using sweeping 702 searches to detect drug, immigration, or other activities in a manner that avoids the restrictions of warrants required by the Constitution, subverts normal criminal law procedures. So they're just breaking the basic deal they made, which is they're using it for regular criminal law stuff. And then finally on this, more specifically, the NSA can't even reliably sort out like what information it's supposed to have and what information it isn't. And this is from David Criss in Lawfare of 2018. And he just points out that the NSA itself has announced a startling failure in the implementation of the USA Freedom Act in 2015. According to a public statement released by NSA on June 28th, the call detail records that NSA has been receiving from telephone companies in the act are so infected with errors that it can't tell which ones it should have and which ones it should not have. And so it basically just had to go delete them, right? It had to get rid of them because it can't tell which ones it's supposed to have. And the basic idea is you just want to tell the judge, look, at the end of the day, this agency is a spy agency. They were meant to go like try to collect, some information about Russian communications in the old Soviet Union from satellite messages. They are just a terrible fit when it comes to balancing the rights of American citizens and lawful permanent residents. They have as Section 215 mentioned, they have withheld information from Congress. They have misled. They have just done a very poor job. And the best scenario is to just get them out of the business of looking at American citizens and lawful permanent residents altogether. You can't fix it. You have to basically just move on and get them out altogether. So those are the general themes on the pro. And in a second, we'll come back and look at the con. Okay, so on the con, again, kind of tough to point to massive numeric certain impacts just because of the nature of it. But there are sort of four principles, four general ideas I want to get across. So let's see if we can do that really quickly. The first is that the idea that the word end has to play a major role in the con's advocacy, right? The first reason is, and this creates a big problem for the pro, is that most of the programs that would have raised the most concern about surveillance by NSA have already ended. And it's important for the con to explain to the judge, you cannot evaluate the round based on things that are no longer happening. You cannot vote to end something that is no longer happening. And we talked earlier in the timeline about all the things that have fallen by the wayside in recent years, right? So in 2007, we got rid of targeted warrantless surveillance. And in 2015, we got rid of bulk data collection under U.S. Of U.S. communications without a warrant. And in 2017, NSA voluntarily got rid of upstream collection, and in 2019, it voluntarily got rid of call detail records. And so, what you see is that huge portions of the stuff that people were writing about in these older cards are gone, right? So if your opponent comes in and they're reading sort of generic cards from 2010 or 2013 or even, even 2015 or 17, right? One thing you really need to be hammering on is the idea that they are not talking about the world that exists right now. They're talking about a world in which the powers of the NSA were greater, and you need to absolutely ask them, hold on. How is that in any way relevant to ending the few things that are left now, right? The things that are left now are warrant-based surveillance under the FISA court, right? And Section 702 surveillance. But remember, only part of Section 702 surveillance is left because we got rid of the worst part, which is upstream, right? So we really only have the downstream part of that left. So you read these old cards about how bad things were back when they had all this power. How do they in any way link to ending the narrow, small rump, like shell, whatever you want to call it, the part that's left, right, of what we have left, right? And you should argue that they don't, right? Only cards that are recent enough, if you're on the con, that they actually post-date the latest developments, which is really 2019 at the earliest, right, should be, relevant to what we're doing today, right? The other thing about ending is that even the most radical opponents of U.S. surveillance apparatus don't believe in ending all of it, right? So first, again, as we noted earlier, surveillance includes both warrantless and warrant-based surveillance. You have to hammer that, right? And so Pro's burden is to show you not just why bulk data collection is bad, which is what the vast majority of the literature says, but why the NSA should not be able to look at a specific suspect and have good probable cause-based information that they are a potential terrorist, and they should not be able to go to the FISA court and get a warrant to go and surveil them. That just doesn't make sense. And it's really, unfortunately, it's tough to find a card. In my research, I looked for people arguing for this. I looked really hard. It's tough to find a card that says nobody is arguing this, right? But they aren't, right? And one way you can put it back on the pro is to say, okay, look, one of the things you got to do to win this round is to show us that you shouldn't be able to go get a FISA warrant and about a specific person. Do you have any author? Do you have any source? Do you have any expert anywhere who says that that should end? If that doesn't end, all you're doing is you're changing the NSA surveillance. You may be reducing the NSA surveillance, but you are not ending it. If you can't give us one author that says that should go away entirely, then you just prima facie cannot meet your burden in the debate, right? And like I said earlier, even the most radical folks out there don't believe in doing away with it entirely. So for example, back in 2013, in the wake of Edward Snowden, David Brin wrote a pretty fiery article about how bad the NSA was, but even he said, right, this is a good card, the answer isn't to cower or hide from Big Brother, nor to blind our watchdogs. The solution is to answer surveillance with looking back at the mighty from below, holding light accountable with reciprocal light, letting our watchdogs see, but imposing choke chain limits on what they do. That distinction is crucial. Instead of obsessing about what the FBI and NSA may know, let's demand fierce tools of supervision to keep the dog from becoming a wolf. So again, even the harshest critics of the NSA don't believe that you just completely blind it, you completely tie its hands and get rid of its ability to do clearly warranted searches, right? And I think that's a very important principle. The second major principle on the con is going to be if the NSA ends surveillance, it's just going to be continued by other agencies. Now, we pointed to this fact earlier, but you have 15 other intelligence agencies. Now, some of them aren't going to do anything like what the NSA does, like, the Coast Guard, I don't know who they are, but like naval intelligence or whatever. They're not going to do the same thing, but there are some that do, right? We pointed to the fact that the FBI is already conducting thousands of searches pursuant to FISA, getting FISA warrants about national security against both foreign individuals and U.S. persons, right? It doesn't currently have the ability to do 702 surveillance under Executive Order 13470, but it can, get the information from a 702 search and use it. And the important thing is, 13470 specifically says that the Secretary of Defense can authorize other agencies to do mass electronic surveillance, to do SIG-INT, basically, if it wants to, right? So if the NSA tomorrow is shut down from doing surveillance that appears to be necessary, that incorporates or encompasses U.S. persons, and the government looks at it and says, gosh, I think there's a blind spot, I think there's a risk there, all that has to happen is the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence have to get together and issue an order saying, okay, now the FBI can do it, or okay, now the CIA can do it, right? They don't even have to pass a statute. They don't have to even go to the president. They don't have to have a regulation. Two people, right, have to issue an order which they could do in a day. Right? Under 13470, it specifically says the Secretary of Defense can slide any of these functions, including the functions under 702 or anything else, SIG-INT basically, right? Can slide over to any other agency, right? And in addition to that, we know the FBI is already doing a lot of these searches, so they would be a natural candidate. Now, you don't necessarily have to have this as a separate contention. You don't necessarily have to put it in the case. It's just a nice theme to use to sort of harass the pro on every single impact that they have. Basically, you say, Judge, look, if they can't prove that one of these other 15 agencies wouldn't just take over the surveillance, they're going to have to show you that the government will just throw up its hands and say, oh, well, I guess we just have to be blind to terrorism. I guess we just have to, even if we know Brett Harvey is likely planning to, bomb Memphis or something like that, we just can't do anything about it. They're not going to do that. They're going to use the authority under 13470 to slide these functions over to another agency, which they can do in a day, right? And then there's another argument you could use, which is that arguably, it might be worse. It might just not be a zero-sum game. It might be worse to send these functions over to the FBI because, as troubling as some of the NSA's history is in terms of not being candid, right, with Congress, the FBI, did some really nasty stuff like back in the, 1950s and 60s, in the civil rights movement. So I'm not going to look up a bunch of information on that, but if you want to do some of your own research, you might be able to argue that, as between the two agencies, one of them's going to do it, right? If the NSA gets taken out of the game and put on the bench, then, the FBI is going to shoot the ball, right? And the FBI arguably might be even worse. I'll leave that to you to see if you want to run that down, but that's a possibility. Now, the other argument would be, and this is something you kind of have to have, it's part of the basic case that most everybody runs, is that this surveillance is necessary to stop terrorism. Now, I know I kind of trash talk this statistic about how the NSA surveillance has stopped 50 plus terror plots, but I do think it's important that you have it available. It may very well have a role in the case, and you need to be able to defend it. And the argument is, you can see on the card here that we're just showing you is that NSA Chief General Keith Alexander claims that they have prevented potential terrorist attacks over 50 times since 9/11. Again, we can't prove it, but one of the arguments the pro can make is, look, you can't ask us to go and detail stuff that is highly confidential, that's classified. It has to be classified because otherwise it compromises our ability to, people know where our intelligence came from if we start explaining how we got all this stuff, right? So it's not fair to ask us to tell you every single one of them. It's the best data we have. It's not perfect, but you should go with some data over, like if we have some information and they have none, you should prefer ours, right? More specifically, warrantless surveillance under 702 is essential to stopping high-profile attacks. So Pierre Hines noted in 2013 that Keith Alexander also specifically said that NSA surveillance programs had a significant impact on intercepting emails from a terrorist in Pakistan that led to foiling a plan to bomb the New York subway. NSA's program helped prevent a bomb in the New York Stock Exchange. Intelligence led to the arrest of a U.S. citizen who planned to bomb a Danish newspaper that published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And number 4, the NSA's programs triggered reopening of the 9/11 investigation and gave some new information on how that happened. The other really important thing that they said in this article is that Alexander claimed that the intelligence gathered from 702 specifically contributed in over 90% of the 50 cases. So in other words, this wasn't stuff you can get from warrants. This has to be broad dragnet style mass searching according to the director. Now again, is it perfect? No, it comes from the NSA, but something's got to be better than nothing, Judge. You can't just discount it because our opponents say it's not perfect, right? The last thing you might say on this point is that surveillance of any kind, you can't do any kind of surveillance, domestic or foreign, without sweeping in some data about U.S. persons, right? So, there is one preliminary point that we talked about earlier, which is that the con might argue that 702 surveillance, right, is not topical at all, right? You could argue that 702 surveillance is not surveillance of a U.S. person. It is surveillance of a non-U.S. person by legal definition that might sweep in a U.S. person, but it's not topical because the person being surveilled, right, the person of whom the surveillance is happening is not a U.S. person. But if you don't go with that, right, The alternative is to point out that you literally just can't do any surveillance. You can't pick and choose. You can't say, oh, well, NSA will only do foreign surveillance, but not domestic surveillance. Because even NSA skeptic groups like ProPublica admit, quote, it is not always possible to separate domestic from foreign communications by automatic means. Consequently, the NSA still captures some amount of purely domestic communication. Likewise, Shane Harris in Foreign Policy in 2013 says that, is critiquing the NSA's surveillance apparatus. But even this critic admits there's only one problem with this longstanding contention. People who've worked within the system say it's more or less technically impossible to keep average Americans out of the surveillance drift net. So if even critics admit that you can't keep the two separate, you basically say to the judge, you've got to make a choice. Like if the NSA is going to be able to do its job of going out and intercepting surveillance information, like data about anybody, people who are foreign nationals, have never been to the United States. We live in a global society, right? I know we live in a society, but we live in a global society where people communicate with each other all across the planet, right? You cannot do general surveillance of people's correspondence, even the worst of the worst folks in other countries who are planning on harming the United States, without some risk that you will intercept some communications from U.S. individuals. There is no way to avoid it. There is no marker that sits on everybody's emails saying, oh, by the way, this is a U.S. person, just in case a security agency wants to get it. So it's a binary choice, Judge. If you consider these incidental collections to be surveillance of, fair enough. If that's what you believe, Judge, fine. But if that's the case, right, then that means you have to make a binary choice between either the NSA gets some of that stuff inevitably, or it just doesn't do any surveillance at all. We just shut it down. We don't do any international surveillance whatsoever, foreign or domestic. And I think that's a good way to explain it. We're not doing this because we want this domestic information. We're doing it because there's no way to do it without encountering some of it, right? A third point you want to have, I think, or maybe this is a fourth point, I don't know, I'll get my numbers off, is that Section 702 warrantless surveillance doesn't violate any legal privacy interest. And there's a really good opinion from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the circuit courts that's right below the Supreme Court, back in 2018 in a case called United States versus Hasbajrami. I think that's how you say it. I always butcher names, but Hasbajrami. That lays out a very detailed discussion of both how 702 works and a detailed discussion of why it doesn't violate any legal constitutional Fourth Amendment rights. So the explanation of 702 surveillance starts on page 14, and it's really written in a good, fairly layperson-friendly way. You might just want to read it to understand it, but there might be a card or two in there if you want to cut one. The explanation of why 702 doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment starts on page 47. It's a little more complicated, but it's still pretty clear. On page 54, the court holds that the Fourth Amendment does not require a warrant to do 702 collection. And then on page 60, there's a really good discussion of how the court is sort of balancing privacy interests with the need for national security in its Fourth Amendment analysis. And it says this: privacy interests can be outweighed by the government's manifest need to monitor the communication of foreign agents of terrorist organizations operating abroad. And this need outweighs that interest in privacy and makes the incidental collection of communications between such foreigners and United States persons reasonable. Later, it adds, if it is reasonable and indeed necessary to the national security for intelligence agencies to monitor communications of suspected foreign terrorists abroad, the need to keep track of potential threats from abroad does not lessen because some of the suspects' contacts turn out to be American nationals or foreign nationals located within the United States. And when the conversations being monitored constitute evidence of criminal conspiracies between foreign operatives and someone within the United States, the urgency becomes greater and not less. So this is the legal analysis, right? This is how the court balanced privacy, right, versus the need for security. And this was the conclusion it drew. It does not violate the Fourth Amendment. So if people start talking about legal rights, you can say, oh, no, hold on. We're not experts. We should defer to the courts. I can point you to the exact page where the second highest court in the country, right, because the Supreme Court hasn't looked at it, is telling you this does not violate any legal constitutional rights. So that's not a question. That's just a fact, right? And then the last one, I guess point number 5 is it now, is that privacy concerns are overstated. And you sort of want to argue that all these concerns about privacy, people getting all worried about it, really aren't that significant. First, there's very little meaningful data about Americans that is collected through warrantless mass surveillance, right? Even before Section 215 was reduced in scope and reformed in 2015, the Wall Street Journal had a really good article called thank you for data mining. And in that article, it says this: the real danger from the Snowden leak is potential political overreaction. The NSA is collecting less information than appears on a monthly phone bill because it has no names. But Americans would worry less about the government spying on them if, for example, the Justice Department wasn't secretly spying on the Associated Press and Fox News, or if the IRS wasn't targeting White House critics, or if the administration in general showed a higher regard for the law when it conflicted with its policy preferences. So the basic idea here is we shouldn't confuse these sort of generic concerns about the government getting substantive information with what we're getting from 702 and things like that, which is really less information than you see on a person's phone bill. And then in another article, this is from Eric Posner, who's a widely respected law professor. He points out how much information we give to the government and other institutions that is so much greater than the stuff that is collected by this program, and nobody cares about it, right? He says, quote, "We already give the government an enormous amount of information about our lives, and we seem to have gotten used to the idea that an Internal Revenue Service knows our finances, or that an employee of a government hospital knows our medical history, or that social workers, if we're on welfare, know our relationships with our family members, or that public school teachers know about our children's abilities and personalities. The information vacuumed up by the NSA was already available to faceless bureaucrats and phone and internet companies, not government employees, but strangers just the same. Many people write as though we make some great sacrifice by disclosing private information to others, but in fact, it is simply the way we obtain services we want, whether the market services of doctors, insurance companies, internet service providers, employers, therapists, and the rest, or the non-market services of the government like welfare and security." And this is a really good point. I mean, if your opponents start doing these waxing poetic and doing these soliloquies about like how awful it is that we're losing, privacy, ask them to explain exactly what privacy we're talking about. We're not, generally speaking, intercepting your actual calls through 702. We would do that through warrant-based surveillance, but that apparently is not what you want to talk about, right? So, but we're not intercepting that information. We're learning about like how, the length of calls and how many calls you made. And for the vast majority of people, there's just no reason to be worried about that, right? And then lastly, concerns about curtailing free expression or any of these other links to like major political problems are largely imaginary. This is also from Eric Posner back in 2013. And he just says, the second objection is a lot more serious. We know that our government is capable of misusing information in this way being like quashing political enemies, right? As that occurred during the Nixon administration. Many people seem to believe that President Obama sent telepathic signals to IRS workers instructing them to harass Tea Party organizations. But I am unaware, and correct me if I'm wrong, of a single instance during the last 12 years, in other words, going back to 9/11, of war on terror surveillance in which the government has used information obtained for security purposes to target a political opponent, dissenter, or critic. That means for now that this objection is strictly theoretical and mere potential for abuse can't by itself be a good reason to shut down a program. If it were, we would have no government, right? And so this is the basic idea that all of these concerns about privacy, invasions of privacy, are minimal. They are largely hypothetical. The pro can't quantify them, and they are not good reasons for doing away entirely with the NSA's entire involvement in collecting of data. So those are the basic themes on the pro. We'll come back in just a second with a few quick final thoughts. All right, so final thoughts really quickly. I'm not going to lie to you folks, this was a tough video to do. Probably the single toughest video that I've done since we started doing the channel. I usually do the prep for these at night, like after work. And I will tell you that it took me probably 3 solid nights to really wrap my brain around what was going on here. Number one, because this is just an intrinsically complicated subject. The law behind it is complex, and I like to try to make sure at least I understand that so I don't mislead you. And also because, again, the wording of the topic just makes it so that you have to do a lot of work to make sure that you're actually kind of sort of framing it in terms of what the resolution actually says. But at any rate, the basic most important tip that I have is, first of all, I hope the video is useful to you. I'm sorry that it's taken so long because it actually delayed the LD video. So if you have LD folks on your team, tell them I'm sorry that it won't be probably available for this weekend's tournaments for the first weekend. It will certainly be after that. We have it in the works right now. But at any rate, the basic takeaway is you got to get out in front of this resolution and grab the bull by the horns in terms of framing right from the very beginning and tell the judge very clearly on either side exactly what it is in practical terms that's going to change if you vote for the pro, good or bad, whichever side you're on, right? You've got to explain in practical terms, and you've got to be ready to back that up. If you don't do that, this can go off the rails very quickly. You can have two sides talking about completely different things on definitional questions and framing questions, and they're just two ships passing in the night, and that's endlessly frustrating for judges, right? So you want to get out there, and if you are on the pro, you want to be very clear and say, look, we're running a case about whether to get rid of 702, and here's why, or whatever you're going to do, right? And to be able to explain that, right, in very practical, simple terms, right? Because you're not going to have a piece of literature that gives you a plan for abolishing NSA surveillance. You can't just read a card, so you have to explain it. Other than that, it's just a very simple matter of knowing as much as you can, knowing a little bit about the history, knowing a little bit about the law, and of course, if something sounds too good to be true, calling it out, because there really aren't a lot of impacts on this that are going to be, just massive, measurable, quantifiable things that we know for sure. And if anybody's claiming that, you need to be able to explain why it's not accurate. So again, sorry I can't tell you this is the greatest resolution in the history of the world, but I'm glad we're in a new calendar year. I'm glad we're making our way, hopefully, toward actually seeing each other at tournaments, hopefully sometime soon. And so with that, I will wish you the best of luck in what hopefully will be a fantastic 2021 for you, and close by saying what I always say, which is debate is supposed to be fun. It's for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hail safe.